Welcome to Ben Omet's blogs. Reading out a story this time. It's called The Tale of the Good Brother, Chapter 1. There once lived a man who, as a child, was the friend of a prince. When the prince grew up, he became king, and the man, whose name was Ampelio, soon forgot about his famous childhood acquaintance. Forgot, that is, until he was summoned by a most urgent message to attend the king forthwith. Hastening to obey his liege's summons, Ampelio packed his few belongings and made his way to the coast where the king resided in his summer palace. Arriving a few days later, Ampelio was ushered into the magnificent gardens where the king waited impatiently. "There you are," he said. Um, the king without acknowledging Ampelio's greeting, and waving aside his apologies for the slowness of his horse. "Come, Ampelio, my friend. I wish for you to see a marvel." So saying, the king led him to a bench which overlooked the ocean, and gestured for him to sit. The king then said nothing, instead leaning forward somewhat, waiting for something. Suddenly, a huge flock of sparrows rushed up from the cliffs below, starting Ampelio, and caused the king to cry out in satisfaction. "There!" shouted the king. Just as when we were young, and you told me it signified that I would rise to kinghood. Well, Ampelio, what does it signify now?" Ampelio looked bemused at his old friend, struggling to remember the incident of his childhood, soothsaying, and indeed not regretting it a little. I am not sure if it signifies anything, my lord," he stammered. The king's face darkened, but after a moment he signalled for his friend to follow, and then they made their way among the flowering shrubs and vines. It wasn't long before the king spotted a most unusual formation of clouds and stopped, smiling broadly as he pointed out to Ampelio. But Ampelio only looked sad and shook his head. The king's broad smile faded, only to be replaced by a look of terrible rage. It was a few moments before he could speak. "Are you telling me that you have exhausted your powers of seeing the future? When we were children, you told me the clouds once formed to show the beautiful wife I would one day have. You told me the pattern of bird and snake tracks in the sand we once found signified the two strong children she would bear me. What do the signs signify now? Tell me," raged the king. Ampelio staggered back trembling, having no clue of what to say. "Because of you, she bore two headstrong children, who have usurped my kingship. So, great prophet, what do you see for me now?" Ampelio looked heavenward, he knew not why, only to see a hawk take a dove in mid-flight. But he held his peace, saying nothing, holding his hands out imploringly to his old friend instead. But before the king could utter his kingly sentence on Ampelio, they heard soldiers talking, and both fell silent. "Our orders were to kill the king, and only the king," they heard the first say. "And what of the other? Were we supposed to leave him alive to tell the tale?" answered the second. The king didn't wait to hear what the treacherous soldiers were to decide, but rather put his finger to his lips and gestured for Ampelio to follow him through some secret passages he knew, thus effecting their escape from the garden, the palace, and the soldiers. It was many days of wandering aimlessly along the barren coast under the merciless sun before the king spoke again. I am sorry, my friend. I have wronged you greatly." Ampelio shook his head. "No, my liege, it is I who have wronged you. I was a foolish child to become carried away with my fanciful imagination and tell you such things." But the king shook his head. "You meant me no harm. You were a child, and perhaps you truly believed in what you were saying. Now I must ask you to forgive me before I tell you what revenge I took in my grief, in my anger." Ampelio felt a chill steal over his heart, but he stood nonetheless. "You are forgiven, my king." The king said heavily, "They had neither eaten nor drunken in all this time, and both were close to death." Forcing himself to swallow against the terrible dryness of his throat, The king then began to tell of how he had secretly had Ampelia's brother imprisoned in Tunisia, and his sister secretly betrothed to a foreign lord, and famous for his jealousy and meanness of spirit. So finishing his confession, the king lay down and breathed his last, leaving Ampelio to close his eyes and weep for all that was left. Chapter 2. The Tale of the Good Brother. Not even having the strength left to at least cover the king's body with stones, Ampelio made his way down to a stony beach, and lay down having no other intention but to let nature take its course. But the ocean spray alighting on his face revived him somewhat, and finding no peace from his suffering and apathy, arose to stagger along the beach until at last he came upon a small fishing village. It was many weeks before he had regained enough strength to leave the village, and he had much time to consider what course of action he should take. Firstly, he found his way back to where he had left the body of the king, and with the help of the villagers buried him and erected a monument as good as they were able. Next he travelled to the city, and made many discreet inquiries as to the fate of his sister, to at last discover that she was something of a prisoner too, held by the bonds of her mean husband's love in a fortress in Alexandria. Gathering up his life savings, Ampelio took a ship first to Tunisia, for it seemed to him his brother had fared the worst of the king's wrath, and once there rented apartments suitable to his station and rank. But it was a full year before Ampelio could discover the exact whereabouts of his brother without raising alarm, and not living frugally by any means, soon exhausted his funds, so that he was forced to set off to rescue his brother with nothing but his courage and a few silver pieces. Arriving by night at the desert tower where his brother was held captive, Ampelio tethered his horses, then crept stealthily towards the dark gates. There he heard some guards talking, and thanks to the fact he had learned the language of that place during his sojourn, he was able to make out the conversation. Said guard 1, "And how long do you suppose they will keep sending supplies now that the plague has taken that land?" Answered guard 2, "As long as they do, I shall continue in this, for my family and yours is well provided for in this occupation." Ampelio smiled wryly, for his brother was a good man, and would probably be pleased to know that even as a prisoner he was still doing some good. But the news of the plague in his homeland steeled his resolve. Clearly the supplies the dead king had arranged to maintain his brother's imprisonment could not long continue under such calamitous circumstances, and after that his brother would surely be killed to silence him. Ampelio waited until he heard the guards fall soundly asleep, then made his way up the side of the tower by means of a rope and grapple, and peered into the chamber where his brother sat at a candle-lit desk, pale and sallow, writing feverishly upon a parchment. Indeed, a great many parchments lay rolled and bound hard by the desk, presumably already complete. And by the looks of the writing supplies that lay about the sparse room, he was planning to write a great deal more. "Brother!" called out Ampelio, beginning to feel the strain of holding on to the rope. His brother looked about in confusion, finally seeing Ampelio's head peeking over the sill of the small window. "Hurry! We must go before your guards awaken." Ampelio's brother hastened first to the window, then back to his desk, seemingly conflicted as to what course of action was truly the right one. "There is no time for that now," hissed Ampelio. At last his brother seemed to reach a decision, and followed Ampelio empty-handed down the rope, then out into the silent desert. It didn't take very long before Ampelio's brother divined they were poorly provisioned in every way for a journey, but being a good-natured and clever fellow, soon found occupation in crafting trinkets from whatever material they came across. These they sold for a few copper pieces in the markets of the towns they passed through, and surviving in this fashion, soon made their way to a great city. Whilst his brother carried out his new occupation, Ampelio made exhaustive inquiries until he found a proper occupation for his brother, taking care of the accounts of a well-to-do merchant, with himself as his brother's servant. But though they were now somewhat settled and safe, there arose from within Ampelio an insatiable desire to discover the fate of his homeland and his sister. So he began to make inquiries of the kitchen maid, who every day travelled to the portside markets to buy fish, if the sailors there had heard anything about the fate of the plague-stricken Andalusia. But she was unwilling to ask, and Peleo, being also unwilling to venture to the docks of that city, had no recourse but to pester the maid until at last she relented and agreed to his scheme. But on that day the maid was very late returning, and indeed made herself scarce after that, proclaiming sickness and shutting herself up in the servants' quarters. It was a week before Ampelio finally convinced the cook to let him see her. When he did, there was darkness and rankness in her chamber. "Are you there?" he called tremulously to the shape lying prostrate on the straw-covered pile of boards. The shape slowly arose to reveal itself as the maid, pale, hollow-eyed, and reeking of death. "You!" she rasped before succumbing to a fit of coughing. Unable to help himself, and in spite of the maid's horrific condition, Ampelio pressed on. "What news of Andalusia and its king, good woman?" She was long in answering, but when she did it was with contempt. "The devil has taken Andalusia, you worm, and ogres have eaten your king." She spat, sending a long globule of blood spinning his way. He quickly dodged to the side and ran back to his apartments, and having no recourse for the menacing foreboding in his breast, but the rituals of his childhood, washed his feet and hands, donned a cloak, then prayed. It wasn't many days before rumours of a plague in the great city began to circulate, and soon enough the members of the merchant's household began one by one to fall to the dread sickness. A few months later, Ampelio sat beside his brother. They were the sole survivors of that house, but soon Ampelio knew he would be alone. Awakening for the final time, his brother smiled through cracked lips. Thin and white, he was but a shadow of his former self. Making as if to walk, he leaned forward and seemed to form the words "thank you," but lacking the power, lay back, his eyes clouding over in death. Long did Ampelio weep, and sealing each chamber of the house with lime, made his way to the inner courtyard, where he had stored up provisions should he survive. Burying his brother under an orange tree, he prayed after his way, washed himself according to the ritual by the well, and settled down into the winter of his soul. Chapter 3. Awakening with a start, Ampelio was suddenly deafened by the sound of the absolute and perfect silence. It had been many months since his brother had died, and he had been existing in the diseased merchant's courtyard ever since. But he could abide there no longer, and gathering provisions, made his way over the roof, intending by this method to avoid the disease-stricken house. But once atop the roof, he had the view of the great city in its entirety, observing to his horror that nothing stirred there whatsoever but gangs of roving dogs. Little knowing what this might signify, Ampelio made his way down from the rooftop onto the street below, and began to make his way along in the strange quiet. Before long he came face to face with a mangy cur, which growled menacingly and would not be frightened off with waving arms and shouts. Indeed, Ampelio's efforts to frighten the dog only attracted more of its kind, whose loud bark soon attracted the attention of a filthy rag-covered band of cutthroats, the new lords and masters of the hellish world the great city had become. Running for his life, with dogs and robbers close behind, Ampelio soon found himself at the docks, where he took refuge in an abandoned fishing bark until his pursuers had given up their hunt. Seeing no way through the city, and little imagining what was involved in sailing such a vessel, Ampelio found a smallish boat having but a single mast, and stowing his provisions, untied the ropes and let the tide take him out onto the darkening ocean. But his ignorance of sailing was soon revealed to him, for in the night he was unable to untie the ropes which bound the sail, and was driven this way and that by the tide and wind, until by morning the constant battering of the waves side on to the little ship left him incapacitated by seasickness. So he spent the next few weeks lurching about the wind-driven vessel, never seeing anything but sea and sky, until by infinitely slow degrees managed to set the sails and maintain the vessel on a bearing in accordance with the sun's position. It availed him little, however, when he sighted an island, for he could not seem to make the boat travel towards the broad beach, sailing instead along the coast a long way until a wind change when he rounded the headlands, steering him unerringly towards jagged sets of rocks. Filling the sails, he went below to await his doom, and before long was rewarded with a grinding screech as the vessel was driven hard up into the shoals on the leeward island shore. Peeking over the gunwales, Ampilio saw that the rocks, on closer inspection, were spaced many arrow flights apart, their seeming close proximity being illusion furnished by the angle from which he had first viewed them. Taking his provisions, he made his way across the barren headlands until presently he came across some simply dressed peasants who stared at him at first as if he had dropped straight out of the sky. By various signs he made it plain he was to see someone of importance, and the island folk led him to their shabby village. He was taken from hovel to hovel, where the peasants insisted on trading his precious grain for odd trinkets of a very curious sort, and then on to the seashore, where the headman soon stood supervising the mending of fishing nets. Ampilio was suddenly struck by the astonishing idea, for he reasoned that the young men fixing the nets must be fishermen and know the ways of the sea. He would hire one and have him sail him about, trading here and there what he might find, until at last he could reach Alexandria and discover the fate of his sister. But he had to convince the surly headman to relinquish one of his folk first, and by the way the man was eyeing his grain sack, he knew it cost him all. A few days later, having provisioned his tiny ship and gathered a crew of one, the island folk helped launch his vessel by means of grease and a great deal of effort. Taking charge, the young fishermen soon had them sailing at a smart pace, and it wasn't long before they were tied up safely in the port city of Cairo, where Ampilio meant to make his mark as a great merchant. The Tale of the Good Brother, Chapter 4. After 2 years of hard work, thrift and good business sense, Ampilio found himself with a fine ship and a worthy crew. He decided now was the time to seek out his sister to discover her fate, and set course for Alexandria. Arriving there a few weeks later, he hired some brave-looking guards, then went to the less favourable places trying to find some information on the whereabouts of the cruel lord's castle, where his sister was supposedly held as a captive. Following a lead, Ampilio ventured with his men into the heart of Alexandria's criminal district. Passing down a dark alley, he was met by his informant, who stood between two menacing-looking cutthroats. "Did you bring the gold, merchant?" hissed the man, his face twisting into a leer. Ampilio nodded, and had no sooner withdrawn his purse from his jacket when the treacherous rogue let out a cry, bringing a gang of pirates rushing out of the shadows. With nowhere to run, Ampilio drew his sword, but to no avail. He and his men were soon cut down, robbed, and left for dead in the gutter. When Ampilio awoke a few days later, he found himself without the use of his left arm and right leg. His body and face were crusted with blood and bruises, and for all the world he might have been a helpless beggar, who had lived out all his days on the wretched back alley streets of that ancient city. Indeed, his cries for help were met with derision and sometimes even a few coppers, but no one approached him to really help. Too weak and pain to go far, Ampilio despaired of life, but despising to die, doggedly spent each and every miserable day begging for some small morsel of food by which he might survive. So our unfortunate hero spent the next 8 months, washed at night by tears of sorrow, dried the next day by the beating sun and drying wind. He became almost a part of the street corner where his infirmities had fixed him. Then one day 3 wealthy young men came his way looking for some sport, and he was selected as the target of their jest. And I'm going to finish there, and we'll continue in just a moment.